Hello and welcome to another episode of Atomic Vinyl Reviews. My name is Jacob, and today I'm going to be showing you guys a really cool method of cloning little plastic bits and pieces. Have you ever had figures, for example MonsterArts figures, that happen to have a piece of them missing, and you need to ask a friend to see if you can get a copy made, or something like this Billiken Mechagodzilla figure here, which happens to be missing one of its fingers here. So this particular figure has die-cast metal fingers, or these little finger missiles, and I can actually just pull one of the other ones off, and it would be really nice if I could actually have a copy of this to actually finish him off and put on his other hand here. If you ever have any problems like this, or you have something like, say, these little Tamashi tanks, these Maser tanks, and if you want to make a little army of these and you don't really want to spend money on like the Tamashi FX sets because they're super expensive, and you want to make these pieces but you want them to be made pretty cheap and pretty easily, because stuff like silicon or the resins and all that other material that you typically use to make molds and stuff like that can be really finicky and definitely very expensive. So if you ever want to do this stuff really cheaply and easily, I got the method for you. And it utilizes this stuff. So this is just a little pack. It's mostly empty now, but it's a little pack of Oyumaru, also known as plastic clay, or there's other brands of it. I think a really well-known one is called blue stuff. And what this is a type of thermoplastic. The idea is, it is a type of plastic, very soft sort of plastic, that you can put in boiling hot water and it will soften up, and then you can actually press whatever you want to make a copy of into this plastic, and then that will become a mold of it and it will harden at room temperature. It doesn't get super hard or anything. It's actually about the consistency of like hot glue. It's kind of like this sort of rubbery plastic, but it's a really good consistency for a mold making material. And the beauty of this stuff is, it hardens at room temperature. It's also completely reusable. You can just keep heating it and reusing it and molding it into whatever shape you want. And it is really cheap. This pack, I think, cost me like 10-15 bucks, and this is 12 pieces in this thing. It's not a very big pack, but for the stuff that I'm making, this stuff is really good, and the fact that it's reusable means you really don't waste anything by using it. This is a great material, and I've been meaning to make a video about it for so long. And the opportunity just came up because I actually wanted to help somebody out, because on one of the Facebook groups I saw somebody was asking about a little piece of their Mechagodzilla MonsterArts figure. They actually are missing this piece on their figure, and I happen to have this figure, and I happen to have this method. So I thought, you know, it's about time I do this video, because quite a while ago I actually made a bunch of stuff using this method, and I really thought it was a great thing and worth doing a video about. This is a little Tamashi Maser tank. This came with my MonsterArts Burning Godzilla figure. The original release version came with two of these. This one and this other little one here. And what I did is I took this one apart, because you can take these apart into little pieces. They're in 3 pieces. You got the top turret, the gun, have this like little middle rotating section, and you have the actual truck part under it there. So they kind of just piece together like so. So I took those apart, and using this method, made a bunch of molds. Here's a little mold of like the actual main part here. You can see this should in theory fit right in here, like so. And if I can find the appropriate top piece, I think this, no, that's not it. I don't happen to have that exact one on hand, but there would be a top piece that seals here. I can actually show you guys another one. For example, this one is a little mold that I made for another person a while ago. It's of Shin Godzilla's hand, of the MonsterArts figure's hand, because they lost theirs, and it's a piece that's easy to lose. And so you make this like 2-part mold. So with this technique, I actually replicated the Tamashi tank pretty well using this method, just to kind of show you guys. Guess which one's the original and which one's the copy? Okay, it's kind of obvious. This one is the copy. It's a little bit rougher, but not by much. Not by much. So you can do some amazing stuff like this, and I've actually got, I'll just show you, I've got a whole handful of these little bits that I copied of this tank. You end up making lots of little pieces like this, and this technique I actually learnt from the wargaming community. You know those people who have those like little figurines and they do like the tabletop wargaming, and those figurines, it turns out, are quite expensive. But what I found out is people in that community, they love to just buy one set of those, and then they can just make molds of them using this method very cheaply, very easily, and then they can just copy as many as they want, and they get, you know, these beautifully detailed figurines. So yeah, great technique, and something that I haven't seen anyone do a video about in the Godzilla community or the Godzilla figure collecting community. And just to show you guys, you can also do other stuff like this. This one didn't turn out quite as nicely as it should have, just because I kind of did it carelessly, but it's a little Jurassic Park keyring copy. But you can do this method to make the copies look pretty much identical if you do this method right. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making a copy of this fin here, and I'm going to be, again, copying this Mechagodzilla finger missile here and showing you guys the process. The most expensive part of this method is you will need something to actually make the mold with, and what I use is epoxy putty. So I use this brand, particularly Epoxy Sculpt. This stuff is really pricey. This particular batch, which is about 500 grams in total, because it comes in two parts, which are like 227 grams in each part. This amount here did cost me like 50 bucks. However, this stuff is amazing, and it has lasted me so long. I've had this for years, and I actually use it quite frequently. And this is how much I've got left of it, so I've barely used like a quarter of this stuff in the time that I've had it, and I've been using it a lot. It's basically a two-part epoxy mix, so you mix it together in equal amounts, and you basically shove it into the mold. So if you... okay, that bit's gone. But if you have, for example, this mold of this hand here, you fill in one half of the mold with it, and you kind of scratch it off so it's like nice and even, and then you fill in the second half with the putty, and then you press them together, and whatever excess there is, if you squish it hard enough, it should kind of squeeze out and just be left as like this sort of flush around the mold, or whatever that's called. And that's basically the process, and leave it for like 3 or 4 hours. It'll come out like this, and this stuff is hard. It's like I don't know if you can hear that. It is like plastic, or almost like stone. It's kind of this really hard material that's really good, and this stuff is really good just for like customizing figures and just adding sculpted detail to anything. It is a very practical material. Even though this putty was very expensive, it's like the best 50 bucks I've ever spent. And that's 50 bucks Australian, so in like the US, this stuff would be a lot cheaper. And you can buy much cheaper versions of it in smaller amounts too. I think like there's a version called Milliput, which you can get in much smaller quantities, and it's basically the same idea, same thing, just this two-part kind of plasticine that turns into plastic. So that's what we're going to be using today. So to start off this process, what we're going to need to do is get some hot water, and then we can continue from there. So for the first part of this process, I just have some freshly boiled water, nice and hot. Now you could either reuse these old pieces and just chuck them in and they will soften, or just for the sake of this video, I'm just going to use one of the new pieces. And that should be enough for at least the first part of our mold. I might just throw in the second piece just so it's already heating up, because hopefully this water will stay hot enough for long enough just so these pieces can heat up. So they're just going to be, they just float on the top of the water here, and we'll just let them sit, and we'll turn them around here and there just until they really soften up, and then we will be able to press them into our little plastic pieces.
2 hours later.
These have been sitting in here for at least 3 minutes, and they seem to be getting pretty soft now. So when I kind of pressing them with these, I can kind of see that they're flopping and they're getting really soft now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take out one of them. Just going to plop it down onto this mat here. There we go. Quickly dry it off. It shouldn't stick to the towel because this stuff is kind of non-stick. It's not really like hot glue, where hot glue can quite easily stick to stuff. This stuff tends to resist that. What I'm going to do, just flatten it out a tiny bit with this glass. It shouldn't burn your hands. It's actually doesn't retain heat that long, so I'm hoping I can get this done quickly enough. I'm just going to cut it so we have 2 pieces. There we go. One for each of these. I'm going to get this piece, and we're just going to press it in. So just like so. Press it in till it's just about halfway in there. Very nice. Try and get the top kind of flat, and we'll do the same thing with this piece. This one might need a bit of work, so I'm just going to fold it in half. This one here to make it thicker, and I'm just going to roll it again. Just again, good to have a nice flat surface if you can, but you know, even a kind of wonky surface will work, but it will make it more difficult later on in the process. So I try to have it nice and flat. Maybe just a little bit more. Okay, flip it over. Okay, put our piece on top like so, and just press it in. This stuff isn't really hot anymore, which is good, but it's still retaining its softness for a little bit. Try to have these like pushed in at the middle point, because then you kind of know how much of that epoxy putty we are going to put in it. Now, what we're going to do real quick is I'm going to grab just some random object. I'm using a, what's it called, screwdriver for this, and I'm just going to put little keyholes in this stuff. The reason being is this helps the molds come together appropriately later on when we do put them together. Starting to harden now, but it'll still retain these keyholes, I hope. There we go. Doesn't overly matter how many of these you have, as long as you got like 2 or 3, but the more the merrier, really. And so there we have the first part of our molds. What you could do is you could dump these in some cold water now just to speed that process up, or just leave them in room temperature for a while until they harden. And then when you're ready, basically the next part of the process is literally just getting more of this material and just plopping it on top and pressing it down until you have a solid 2-part mold, and then pulling it apart. So we'll just wait a little bit for these to cool down, and then we'll do that.
2 hours later.
These two seem to be fairly cool enough. They're about at room temperature, so now we can actually get to the second part, which is the top part of the mold. We just bring back this cup here. It's still got the last piece in it. It's still fairly hot, so it should be nice and pliable. We'll just pull that out like so. There we go. And now we will roll it with this mug, just to flatten it out a little bit. Perfect. There we go. Now I can just slice that in half. Actually, I'll dry it off really quick first, because that's going to be important, actually. Making sure we have a nice dry piece. That side. Let's move it on this side. There we go. We can just cut that. Pull apart. And now we just have to press these together really carefully. So the idea is we don't want any air to be in between these 2 pieces. Now this one might be a little thin on top. I could have probably done it thicker, but it probably will still work. So something like that. Just squish them down. Be really careful to sort of encapsulate and really cover up the actual item you want to mold in here, so there's no air around it. That's the most important thing. So trying to squish this into those little keyholes. And this is the good thing about having this fairly transparent material, so you can actually see what's going on inside, and you can probably see some little air pockety areas if they are in there. Okay. And just like before, I'm gonna leave this to cool down, and I might have to return to this video later on in the day. It'll probably be dark by then, so hopefully my lighting won't be too bad, but I actually gotta run right now. I have some other stuff to do today, but I'll get right back to this. But with the magic of editing, for you guys, it'll be instantaneous, and we'll be able to open these up and then do the next step in this process.
2 hours later.
It's been a couple of hours. It's now nighttime. You really don't have to leave these that long. I just happened to leave them just to cool off because I had to skedoodle to do some business during the day, but now I'm back so we can continue. So these are now very room temperature, so they're all solid. They're not going to warp on you or anything like that. I mean, they are flexible, of course. The material's pretty flexible. Again, it feels kind of like hot glue when it's, you know, not melted. It just happens to have a very different melting point, but really it's a very similar material, and it's a little bit less tacky, even though hot glue like barely sticks to anything, in all honesty. Don't trust hot glue if you want to make sure something's going to hold on for a long time, unless you have a really good mechanical seal over something with the glue, but it's not really going to. Anyway, we're not here to talk about hot glue. Let's pull these apart, and then we can actually start molding our brand new pieces. These can be a little hard to tear apart, but this one's actually probably going to come out quite easy, because you can already see it's peeling off here. But sometimes these are a little bit tacky, but as you can see here, just peels out like so. There we go. Now we have an impression on both of these sides of our little metal piece here. Before I said it was plastic. This is, again, die-cast metal, although the rest of the figure itself is plastic vinyl. So we got this mold here, and now the other one, the little dorsal fin of the other Mechagodzilla. So it just pulls apart like this. It does kind of tack together a little bit, just because, again, when you did press the top piece on, the heat from it kind of melted into the lower piece a little bit, so they will kind of tear apart a little bit. These two are actually came apart really easily, which is pretty good. And there you see, you've got these little bits. So there we go. So now the idea is we remove the little plastic pieces in here, and we got the little indents. Hopefully, if the mold was made well, when we fill these up with the epoxy putty and squish them together, they will bind together really flush, and then when that epoxy putty cures, these things will have basically an exact copy of this piece. So that's what we're going to do now. Our next step will now require the epoxy putty. So you can use, again, any brand of the stuff. You probably don't need very much, especially for something as small as this. A little bit goes a long way with this stuff. Again, I've used barely any of these containers, and I've been using this stuff quite readily for all my projects. Whenever I build like a model kit or something, I use this stuff as gap filler for that. I've modified custom figures, I've done lots of custom sculpts and stuff with this stuff. It's just a great material. It's essentially plasticine that you just mix together, and you can sculpt into whatever you want, and it will turn into like a hard stone-like plastic. So you can also get different grades of this stuff. This is like a sculpting grade, especially this particular brand, Epoxy Sculpt. So this stuff's designed to be sculpted and worked in that manner, but there's also actually quite cheap industrial versions of this stuff that you can find in hardware stores. They usually come in like little cylinders, and you just tear off a bit and then you knead it, and then that's like an industrial version of this stuff. So you can use that to like really bulk out a lot of custom sculpts and stuff, and then use this stuff, or you can use it in conjunction with stuff like Polymer Clay, which is like an oven-baked clay which solidifies into like a similar sort of like hard, almost stone or plastic-like substance after you bake it. But this stuff isn't baked, it's just mixed together. And you can also get it in a bunch of different colors, although I almost always paint this stuff, so it doesn't really matter. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to grab a little bit out of each container. maybe it would be optimal if I use some protection on my hands. I don't know how toxic this stuff is or not. But I make sure my hands are clean after using this stuff anyway, so so far it hasn't caused me any damage, at least I hope. But perhaps that would be ideal. And generally you want to get an even size of each, so I just roll them into little balls, like so. And I try to see whether they're equal in size, so I need a little bit more of this one here. So this one comes in two different styles. We have, you know, this gray one here and this greenish one here, which over time has gotten more of like this oily sheen to the top of it, but generally it's more of a matte finish once you start kneading it, because I think that's just the color leaching, or the dye leaching to the top after all the years I've had this material. So once you've got a little amount of it, you just knead it together, like so. And you do this for a little while, just until you get a nice even consistency of this stuff. And so this is basically just like epoxy resin, a two-part epoxy resin, but in a plasticine-like substance instead of like liquid, which makes it really great to work with. And again, such a great material for sculpting and adding detail without having very much fuss. And you can really like use it to mod existing figures and stuff like that. It's a really great material for that. Yeah, it's good stuff. So once we have it to an even consistency, this stuff should last 2 or 3 hours before it really starts to cure. I would recommend using it within the first hour, because it does slowly start to get a little bit less pliable and less nice to work with. But then eventually it turns into like a stone-like substance, where it gets more brittle and structurally hard. So what we're gonna do, we're just gonna, which one should we do first? Let's try this one first, because this is a fairly large piece. This top one here is probably gonna have a bit less in it, so we'll start off with this one here. So the idea is pretty similar to what we did before, except for instead of plopping the Oyumaru, whatever it's called, the plastic clay over our existing little piece, we're just gonna squish this into the mold. Just press it in like so, until the entire mold has a nice even filling of this stuff. And the idea is we want the top to be quite flat. Get a little more in here. Just use a good amount of pressure. It should get out all those little imperfections. And you can start off with a pretty thin amount of it and then just build up bulk, as long as you got a thin covering across all the detailed parts, because we really want those to come through. The hardest part with doing this method is actually perfecting the amount of putty in this mold, because when you put them together, what's gonna happen if you have too much, you're gonna get a lot of material being squeezed out the edges, and then you'll have to clean those edges, and it's never quite perfect, and it'll just come out looking a little bit rough around the edges, which isn't great. Or if you have too little, of course the pieces won't quite stick together. It'll come out really brittle and just like have air holes in it. It won't be very nice. It's kind of a balancing act, trying to get the perfect amount of material in here, but generally you can be a bit flexible, because if you do a little bit too much, again, squeezing it out isn't going to be the worst thing in the world, but preferably you'd like to have the exact amount if you can, so it might take a few attempts. So that's the trickiest thing about this method, but aside from that, it's a really easy method, and it generally, if you do a couple of attempts, you can just get one that's spot on, and then it's really rewarding at that point. I'm going to fill up the other piece here, so we have that lovely indent there, and we'll start to fill it up with putty. I may have to get some more, just because it's starting to run out for me. There we go. I've just filled up both of these pieces with what I estimate is about the right amount of this putty. This side isn't quite perfect, but I think once we do start squeezing these pieces together, it should fill up this mold. Now you can already see, if we flip it over and look at it just with since it's a clear piece, just in the right angles, you can actually see that it's taking shape inside here already, just because it's, you know, the clear mold. You can actually see the shape of that there. So now what we do, we have to match these pieces together, and that's where these little keyholes come in. Now, I think I didn't make mine quite big enough so that they really have a strong enough little notch on these sides, so that's kind of a problem with mine. If I were doing this again, I would have made much clearer, deeper holes on these pieces and made sure that the top piece was probably even a bit thicker, and that those holes actually melded together with this piece, so you'd have a little protruding little notches that could sit in those holes a bit more easily, so that way you don't have to really guess whether the two bits are actually sitting together properly. But now I've got to actually kind of approximate it. I'm gonna guess that that is about right. Fingers crossed. And now what we do is we literally just squeeze it. Now we don't want to overdo this step either, but these pieces do need to combine together, otherwise we won't have a good completed piece. There we go. Hopefully, fingers crossed, these two will come out perfectly. So I'm just squeezing around the edges especially, just to make sure that the gap between these two pieces is really, really minimal, so that we can just cut off the excess really smoothly without having too much material squeezed out the edges, or too thick of a material, because that could be a problem as well. And there we go. There's one complete. Now I am going to put this down and let it cure overnight. Again, you can open this up in like 2-3 hours, maybe even less in fairly hot climates, because this stuff cures a little faster the hotter it is. But yeah, that basically should do it. It's quite late where I am now, so it's going to be morning by the time I'm going to be awake to open this one. But yeah, let's just rush through doing the second one, just so I can show you guys really quick. Grabbing a little bit of this stuff. Now I don't want to get too much since I don't really want to waste any, and this is going to be a really small piece, so it can be a little hard to judge. It's probably better to get less than more, because you can always make more actually, so I might get a little less. So there, once we get two little bits that are about the same size, we knead them together till they're perfectly mixed into one color. And you just simply grab the mold and you fill it up, like so. Just making sure it's pressed into all of those little details. You can actually get some really fine details with this method, I've noticed. Especially going back to those little Tamashi laser cannon trucks that I made a while ago. They had some really nice details. Some of those castings didn't come out quite perfect, but it was a bit of a learning experience when I was first trying that out, and I did eventually get some really nice results from that. Alright, and again, once you have both pieces nice and evenly filled with the material, we just sandwich them together, trying to make sure they are perfectly aligned, which is why I probably should have made the notch holes better, but there's at least a little bit of a texture there that I can just about feel when they are locked in. So just double checking that, because this is important. Okay, and then we just press them together. Great thing about this, again, this mold material, is it doesn't stick to itself when it is at room temperature, which makes this process so much easier. No need for mold release or any of that crap. Just locks together like that, and I think this stuff is pretty non-stick towards most other materials, so you can pretty much create molds of pretty much anything and it shouldn't stick to this plastic, which is excellent. So there we go. This piece, I'm just, again, making sure it is really well put together. I can see that some of it is just being squeezed out a little bit. What I could try and do is just put a light behind it. I don't know if that's gonna help or make it worse for you guys to see. I don't know. But you can already see the shape through the material. So here's the original and the copy as it is taking form inside the mold. So yeah, I'm gonna leave these to cure now overnight, or at least for 2-3 hours. Here we are about 12 hours later, give or take a few. And these should be well and truly cured now, so they should be nice and solid, nice and ready to pull out of the mold. Now again, you don't have to wait this long. This process can take like 3 hours, but yeah, I had some sleeping to do. So let's pull these apart and see how they turned out. I'm really keen to see if they turned out, because in particular this one looks pretty good. This one has a chance of being perfect on the first go, which would be a lifesaver, because it is always a little bit sad when these don't come out. This one I think has a little bit of an issue because I was kind of peeling it up earlier and it doesn't seem to have perfectly merged at the tip here. Hopefully it'll be okay. So we'll start off with this one. I'll pull it from the back here. Should be pretty easy to do for most of these if they're simple shapes. And yeah, looks like I didn't quite put enough of this putty here. I can already see a gap forming there, but if we just kind of twist the material, it should pop out. And there's our piece. So there are a few gaps in it, but all things considered, this piece might be somewhat usable if I did actually go back in and use more epoxy putty to fill some of those gaps. You can see right there's a nice big hole through it, unfortunately, but we could actually just put some epoxy putty in that hole. And at the tip here, there was also a bit of a lack of material, so there's a little bit of gapping going on right there. As you can also see, there is quite a bit of this material that's around the piece here, and the way we get rid of that is we simply just get a nice sharp scalpel blade, like so. And I don't know if I'll be able to do this on camera very well, but I'll probably be making a duplicate of this anyway, because this one didn't come out quite perfect. But you just carve that away, and hopefully that will come off cleanly, like so. And then you basically just clean up the piece by doing that all around the edges. If you do have some leftover material, again, sometimes you get really lucky and you don't even have to do that. But yeah, this stuff I'll be carving away. But right now we have this nice, fairly solid little piece, and let's quickly compare it to the original. And now, you know, if we did actually clean this up, we got rid of all of the excess material, we filled in the little gaps here, around the edges, especially back here. We filled all that in. I'm pretty confident once you paint this up, if you paint it up to be identical to this one, you probably wouldn't really be able to tell. So yeah, this one might be usable. I'll experiment with it later on. We'll see, or I might just do a brand new one from scratch. But basically, this illustrates the concept perfectly. Now, for the next moment of truth, we're going to jump to our second piece here. And we'll just start peeling it up. Again, this shouldn't be difficult. This actually came off really smoothly because these pieces aren't super complex. They don't have any like indents or edges that really could get caught under this, but sometimes these pieces can be really difficult to pull out if they are complex shapes. This one looks pretty damn seamless. There are some little extra bits of material around the edges, but again, nothing a scalpel blade can't clean up. So again, I just kind of wiggle the piece underneath it just to loosen it, and then it should pop out. There we go. There is our finished little piece. Now again, I probably didn't put enough material in there because it is a little bit gappy around the edges, so that's not always going to happen, but I was being a little bit sparing with this one. What I maybe should have done is maybe I should have squeezed it even tighter back when I was making it, because it's kind of good when you have this mold, because it is kind of flexible, and you have this mushy material in it, just to really play with it, just to really kind of squeeze it all in, because then it becomes one solid mush, and then when the mold settles, it'll kind of expand a little bit, and it should kind of suck the material into the appropriate space in a way. It's not quite as fluid as that to do it perfectly, but it would have helped a little bit, so I was probably a little bit delicate with this piece, but it's still probably usable, and again, we could probably fix that, but I'll probably make another one in the end. But there we go. We've got the original and the replica looking pretty close. The back. Yeah, not bad. So I'm going to quickly just use my scalpel knife, just clean off this piece, and we'll just see if it actually will plug in and fit in our figure, because that's going to be the most important part. Now this material is still fairly soft when it's just like the first day that it's been cast, so you can really cut off this material really easily. It will just kind of crumble off as you cut it, but the longer this stuff is around for, the harder it generally gets. There we go, we got both our little copies here, and now I'm about to test whether this one will actually fit in our actual figure. So we got our Mechagodzilla here. Here's the original piece. It just sits in like so. Pretty simple. Pretty simple. Pretty effective. Pull that out. Now, this piece, I don't think it's perfectly cast. I think the mold wasn't 100% perfectly aligned, but just by like 0.5 millimeter it might have been off. So this might not fit as perfectly as possible. But it's a little tight. Might have made this part a little bit thicker, which is, you know, something that happens. So I can just gently sculpt that a bit down, just because we don't want to force anything. Slot it in. It's getting there. Okay. Look at that. Now, the color is off, but that's something that can easily be rectified with a bit of paint. But if you look at that there, our Mechagodzilla now has a half-decent copy of its fin. So, you know, it's not as nice as the original, obviously. It's handmade, all kind of slightly wonky here and there, but not a bad fit. Look at that. So, yeah, if you're in an emergency, if you really need to duplicate some pieces, this could be a solution for you. This is probably it for this video, actually. I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial. I'm gonna just probably do a few more copies of these, at least one more, just to make sure that actually I get a perfect piece. And then I'll be sending this little piece, after I painted it, over to the dude in America, and oh, I just I pulled it out now and it's actually split in half, so the epoxy putty didn't actually connect. So yeah, that's another sign that I didn't use enough of it, but I think just gluing these together will work just fine. Yeah. You do come into little problems like this with this method every now and again, but again, we just plop these together, get some super glue, paint that up. It shouldn't be bad. Again, I'm going to be making another copy just to make sure it's actually all nice and perfect, because I do want to send this over to somebody to actually use on their actual figure, so I do want it to be nice. And same with this other piece. So ultimately this piece is going to fit in here. Now there is a little bit of metal still stuck in his hand there from the previous die-cast piece. I will have to take that out somehow and then finish off this piece, make it a lot nicer, and then that'll plop in here and he will have his full hand of fingers again. So yeah, this is a very useful method. You can use it to clone all sorts of little pieces, and it's really cheap, really easy, and the best thing is these bits are reusable. You can melt these down, use them as many times as you want, and as long as they don't get too like dust filled or whatever, they'll last you as long as you need. It's not good for big pieces though, so it's probably not really worth it, because the epoxy putty can start to go up in price. So I wouldn't really recommend it for very large pieces, and plus keeping this material heated in large quantities is also tricky, because you have to work really quickly to create the mold. So I wouldn't recommend this for anything bigger than a few centimeters in size, but if you have little small plastic pieces that you want to replicate, this thing will work wonders, this product. So yeah, Oyumaru, if I am pronouncing that right, great stuff, and epoxy putty. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one. But till then, may all your vinyl be irradiated vinyl. Over and out. Bye.